right out of the Cold War. A nest of spies spread across America, from the big cities to the quiet suburbs. June 2010, the FBI and the Department of Justice revealed Operation Ghost Stories, the arrest of a network of Russian spies living and working in America. Some were sleeper agents with deep covers, hiding behind fake American identities. In the world of the clandestine services, they're called illegals.
Illegals have been an intricate, mysterious part of the Soviet system since the creation of the KGB.
Veteran journalist and author Pete Early has written numerous books about the history of espionage.
Because of the Cold War, it took an incredible amount of work, falsified documents, and diligence to get these people out from behind the Iron Curtain and infiltrate them in our society.
In other words, they've come over, they've assumed another identity, in this case, potentially identities of passed away or dead Americans.
Bob Anderson has been with the FBI for 19 years and today serves as the Assistant Director for Counterintelligence.
They then take that identity and persona over.
This is the famous or infamous Murphy House here on our left. No, they just seem to be, a nice family.
Two of them use their real names, Mikhail Semenko and Anna Chapman.
Once the Soviet Union collapsed, and there was this flood of Russian immigrants to the United States. Russians are everywhere. The reason Anna Chapman got so much attention is because she kind of embellished the whole fiery, redhead, sexy James Bond spy that fed all of our fantasies. There is something about the whole James Bond picturesque, exotic, romantic spying that captivates us.
In Russia, espionage is often a family business, and for young Anna Kushenko, it appears this was no different. There are reports her father was a high-ranking officer in the KGB. In 2001, 19-year-old Anna traveled to England, where she met and quickly wed a dashing Englishman named Alex Chapman. This steamy marriage would not last, however, and after divorcing in 2006, Anna Chapman arrived in New York City.
It was in this luxury high-rise in New York's financial district where Anna made her home. The lavish building is a former bank with Art Deco touches and marble hallways. It's a building where newcomers could make contact with ambitious young people.
Here's Anna on the roof of the building being interviewed about her life in Manhattan.
America is a free country, and here it is easiest to meet the most successful people in the world.
Anna tried to fit right in with Manhattan's elite.
When not working on her so-called startup companies, the redhead was out on the town. Meanwhile, 28-year-old Mikhail Semenko was making friends and establishing his credentials in Washington, D.C. He even used a photograph of himself in front of the White House on his LinkedIn page. But little did the young spies know they were both under surveillance by FBI counterintelligence.
We owned almost every facet of their life. We knew what they were doing on a daily basis, when they came, when they went.
According to the criminal complaint, Anna had extensive use of private wireless networks. In this surveillance video, the FBI records Anna casually shopping in a New York department store. Just outside, a Russian official stands ready to exchange information.
So what they do is they set up informations where that they can then burst transmit this information, meaning that you and I don't have to pass by each other by more than 5 or 10 seconds. And all that information, whether it's 2 words or 50 pages, is then downloaded to the other individual.
The FBI also went undercover for Operation Ghost Stories. This video shows Mikhail Semenko in a park in Arlington, Virginia, concealing an envelope with $5,000 cash underneath a bridge. He was instructed to do so by an FBI agent posing as a fellow Russian spy.
We had the illegals under surveillance in just about every manner you can conceivably think of.
Anna and Mikhail were in America for just a few years. Others were here long-term.
The FBI had a variety of surveillances in place for almost 10 years.
Beautiful Montclair, New Jersey, the all-American town, is an idyllic suburb less than 18 miles from New York City.
You're in Upper Montclair, New Jersey. On Marquette Road, we live at 37.
Alan Sokolow has lived in this town for more than 40 years.
And it's a pretty town and a wonderful part of the town because we're surrounded with cul-de-sacs, so it's an especially great place to bring up kids.
In 2008, Alan's neighbors who lived at 31 Marquette Road were moving.
We had a going away party for our longtime neighbors who had lived there, the seniors. And they said to all of us, oh, you'll love to meet the people who bought the house. Hopefully you'll get to know them, and they seem like a great family.
The family was this couple, Richard and Cynthia Murphy, along with their 2 children.
They just seemed to be, a nice family. She was working in a fairly high-powered job in the financial field in the city. I'm not sure he ever had a job per se. You could tell in her speaking voice that it sounded somewhat foreign, maybe Eastern European.
That was because the Murphys were actually Vladimir and Lydia Goryev, 2 deep-cover spies in the U.S. for almost 15 years.
It really shows you how far they're willing to go to fit in and become somebody that you are a trusted member of your community. That's the key. Trust gives you access. Access gives you information which can potentially give you power.
The FBI decrypted a message sent to the Murphys from Moscow. It reads, "You were sent to USA for long-term service trip. Your education, bank accounts, car, house, etc. All these serve one goal. Fulfill your main mission. Develop ties in policy-making circles in U.S. and send intelligence reports to center." For almost a decade, the FBI took numerous surveillance photos of Richard Murphy with other Russian spies and recorded this video of him meeting a fellow Russian named Mikhail Kutsik, who was living near Washington, D.C. under the name Michael Zatoli. The Murphys, Zatoli, and the other illegals lived in various cities throughout the United States. They pursued academic degrees and held jobs in banking and telecom. Donald Heathfield and Tracy Leanne Foley, also known as Andrei Bezrukov, and Elena Vavilova, even groomed their son to become a spy.
When we say long-term, it's 30 years, it's kids, it's get your second generation into the United States.
Coming up.
Staring us in the face with all these local Montclair police cars and FBI agents coming in and out of their house, and it was just a shock.
You're my wife.
Is that right?
In the television series The Americans, Kerry Russell and Matthew Rhys play Russian spies living under deep cover as a suburban couple. The series was inspired by the FBI's Operation Ghost Stories, which revealed a Russian spy ring here in America.
One of the things that we look for in this entire investigation is, do we have the entire network? And that's what you're trying to weave together with these surveillances, whether it's a surveillance of a site where money's buried, or if they're walking past each other exchanging information or money, or sitting in a coffee shop with a computer.
It was inside this Starbucks right near Times Square here in New York City when Anna Chapman met with an undercover FBI agent, but posing as a Russian spy. The two talked about future espionage operations, and Anna said she was ready to act.
Here's video of the June 26, 2010 meeting. They spoke about obtaining fraudulent passports, and Anna produced her broken computer, the one she used for covert communications.
One of the things we look for is, when is that line, or that red line, that we won't let the illegal operation cross versus the security of this nation.
One day after the Starbucks meeting, the FBI decided to act.
It was a Sunday night, and we'd gone out to dinner in town and came back and made the usual left-hand turn on Marquette Road, and staring us in the face were all these local Montclair police cars and FBI agents coming in and out of their house, and it was just a shock.
They were all arrested and formally prosecuted and actually pled guilty to the charges.
Just 2 weeks later, a classic scene straight from the Cold War played out in Vienna, Austria. Here's video of the 10 Russian spies being exchanged at the airport for 4 Russians accused of spying for the U.S.
What hasn't changed about spying today is how we catch each other's spies. And the illegals show that. In the end, it was one of their own people who gave them up. There has been only one case that I know of where detective work identified the traitor.
And it was a case that involved treason in the highest echelons of American power. And the traitor was CIA officer Aldrich Ames.
I would never want to see or speak to him again. I have nothing to say to him. It's a waste of my time and my breath.
Sandy Grimes is a 26-year veteran of the CIA. She worked as an analyst against the communist regimes of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. She co-authored with fellow analyst Jean Vertefeuille the book Circle of Treason.
We wanted to tell the story of what became known as the Ames Mole Hunt Team and identifying Rick as our spy.
I started working for the CIA in roughly '65, and I volunteered.
Boston native Paul Redman was a foreign intelligence officer with the CIA for over 30 years, working mainly for the Soviet and East European, or SE, division.
The SE division was trying to steal secrets from essentially the Warsaw Pact, Russia and all the Eastern European countries. Sandy handled the information that came in from General Polyakov.
It was from the second month I joined that agency that my career was intertwined with his, and that lasted probably 15 years.
Born in 1921, Dmitry Palikov fought for the Red Army during World War II, and after the war, joined Soviet military intelligence known as GRU. In the early 1960s, he contacted the Americans with an offer to work as a source.
What was his incentive?
He was not in it for cash. We never paid him more than about $1,000 a year.
Over time, it always boils down to them liking the money, with some exceptions. Polyakov was a huge exception.
He was the crown jewel in Soviet operations. He went from lieutenant colonel to full colonel and finally general. He was the highest ranking Soviet intelligence officer this country has ever run.
He gave information to the CIA. What was his principal way of doing that?
He photographed everything that came across his desk. And additionally, in Moscow, we had no personal meetings with him, so it was a series of dead drops. We had schedules, and he'd mark a signal that we would read. We'd unload the drop, and the drop would contain, I don't know how many canisters
of film.
Of film.
By the mid-1980s, the world began to see cracks in the Iron Curtain.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
I have to say, at the beginning of 1985, business was wonderful for CIA, and particularly the Soviet division.
Business was booming?
We knew more about the KGB and GRU than perhaps any single individual in them. The CIA didn't have one station in Moscow. We had three. We had the traditional one in our embassy, we had one in KGB headquarters, and we had one in GRU headquarters. We had so many sources.
You had that country wired.
We had it covered, and it was against that backdrop that we had no, and I repeat, no indication, none of what was about to happen.
Coming up,
the CIA discovers it has a major problem. It's lost all of its assets. I mean, people are disappearing.
$1985. Topping the box office was the movie Back to the Future. Terrorists hijacked the ocean liner Achille Lauro. And from London, the Live Aid concert was beamed around the world. For the CIA in Langley, Virginia, it was known as the Year of the Spy.
There was a whole bunch of spies, for one reason or another, were exposed. The Walker crowd was exposed. The Pelton thing blew up. Howard blows up big time, also Yurchenko. So there are a whole bunch of spy cases, and that's why it's called Year of the Spy.
But behind these headlines, a quiet devastation was occurring at the agency.
You had sources that were either arrested or disappeared.
That's correct. In August, a KGB officer, Polishchuk, is arrested in Moscow on home leave. Sometime between end of August and the beginning of October. Another one of our sources, Smetanin, is also arrested. Then, November 6, 1985, a KGB officer named Martinov. We never see Martinov again. Also, a KGB officer named Varenik.
Just a few months later, General Dmitry Palikov also disappeared in Moscow.
We're losing cases right and left.
The CIA all of a sudden felt like they couldn't keep anybody safe.
This had never, ever happened before. It was unprecedented.
What did you think?
Obviously, there was a serious problem. There were two theories. One, we have a traitor. Or two, they're reading our communications.
It would take 7 years before Sandy, Paul, and the rest of the CIA discovered that one of the worst traitors in American history was their colleague, Aldrich Ames.
Ames was fascinating to me.
Pete Early spent 50 hours interviewing Aldrich Ames in jail after his arrest and wrote about the experience in his book, Confessions of a Spy. Here is audio of Ames from that interview.
I really prided myself on it for a long time. Was my understanding of the bureaucratic culture, the culture of the foreign ministry, and then later the way they operated in the KGB.
He seemed like just an everyday Washington career official.
He had been a carpool partner of mine in the mid-70s. And, you know, a year or so carpooling with someone 5 days a week, you do learn a lot about him.
Wisconsin native Aldrich Ames' first passion was drama. But when that did not work out, the failed actor joined the agency full-time in 1967. By the early 1980s, Sandy was close to her colleague.
I liked Rick. He was a happy-go-lucky guy. He was an absolute perfect slob. Dirty fingernails, his hair was never combed, his shirt was never tucked in. He was late for everything, whether he was driving or we were driving.
He smoked all the time, he had bad teeth, and he's the kind of guy who had broken eyeglasses.
I found him supercilious, even by my arrogant standards.
Early in his career, Ames was tasked with targeting Soviet intelligence officers for recruitment.
He did a lousy job. He wasn't good at convincing people to betray their country.
You have to be able to develop relationships with people, and that's not Rick.
Ames's social awkwardness, however, did not hinder his ability for extramarital affairs. In 1981, while stationed in Mexico City, undercover as a State Department diplomat, he met a fiery Colombian cultural attaché named Rosario Casas Dupuy.
Rosario was a person of high opinions, and there was no one in her life who she had a higher opinion of than herself.
And people describe her as mean.
She was one of the meanest women on the face of the earth. She berated Rick all the time.
After 2 years in Mexico City, Ames was reassigned back to CIA headquarters in Virginia. He divorced his wife and married Rosario. Though an unsuccessful recruiter, Ames was good at one thing.
He really understood Russia, so his real talent became understanding the Russian people and dealing with Russians who were very difficult to deal with.
In 1993, he became Chief Counterintelligence, Soviet Operations.
And the first thing he did was he familiarized himself with every case. He had access to all the names. He knew all about the covert operations.
But Rosario was becoming a severe financial burden.
She spent extravagantly. I mean, you couldn't keep up with her spending. And there was no way that Rick Ames was going to be able to afford this woman on a GS-14 salary.
So he went looking for revenue.
So he went looking for revenue. In 1985, he was developing a contact, a Soviet arms control specialist named Chubakin, who was assigned to the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C.
Ames was doing what a lot of us did, trying to develop targets in town, and a lot of us did it differently to get out of the wretched bureaucracy and keep our hand in the real business.
It was sanctioned by the CIA and sanctioned by the FBI, and Rick reported each encounter with Chubakin to each organization. So there was nothing unusual about it.
Ames calls him, and Chewbacca goes, "Can't talk to you, can't talk to you, can't talk to you."
Rick's attempts to get Chubakin out for drinks, I think he'd been turned down 2 or 3 times.
Finally, he gets Chewbacca to agree to meet him at a restaurant.
It was at the Mayflower Hotel. Chubakin was a no-show. again. So Rick, after 2 or 3 vodkas, said, well, I'll just walk to the Soviet embassy, walk through the door, and that's how I will volunteer. And that's indeed what he did, because after that, Chuvakhin all of a sudden started being responsive to Rick's overtures for lunches.
Ultimately, he gave up virtually almost all of our Soviet sources.
Knowing that those people are either going to be executed or at least arrested.
Ames' betrayal unleashed a bloodbath in Russia. This video shows the arrest of General Palikov by the KGB in 1986. Another man, Adolf Tolkachev, was also filmed being arrested on a road outside Moscow. Overall, it's believed at least 10 Russians were executed because of Ames' treachery.
Rick's damage was really in human life.
How much money did he make off of
He
this?
received in cash $1.3 million. And then,
1.3 million.
Yeah, and then I think that there was another $1 million waiting for him in the Soviet Union in case he had to run there.
With his ill-gotten cash, Ames and his new wife were living it up. The old Slav with the untucked shirt was no more.
He was beautifully coiffed, wonderful suits. He was extremely arrogant. It was just a different person, totally different personality.
And it was this new Rick who would come under scrutiny when the agency went looking for a traitor within. In the mid-1980s, almost all the CIA Soviet sources and informants had disappeared. For almost 5 years, they searched for a traitor within.
I've often wondered why it took so long to catch Ames, and the only explanation I can come up with is that these were great officers and smart people, dedicated people, but they had lived through what they viewed as the awful era of Angleton.
The infamous James Jesus Angleton was CIA Director of Counterintelligence for 20 years until 1974. He was the inspiration for the Matt Damon character in the movie The Good Shepherd.
James Jesus Angleton had almost destroyed the agency looking for moles that didn't exist. He was paranoid about it. He was convinced the Russians had plants that weren't there. So the agency didn't want to go through that again.
Nevertheless, it was CIA analyst Jean Vertefeuille who in 1991 made it her mission to find the mole.
She asked if she could take one more look at our 85 problem because she felt guilty that she hadn't come up with an answer.
I said, great, so let's do it. And I went and got Sandy Grimes, whom I knew and adored, because she's smart, wonderfully loyal and discreet.
He calls me and asks me if I would like to join Jean.
So the three of us started out doing it.
Several days later, Redmond went to the FBI, and Paul happened to mention to our bureau colleagues that Jean was going to take another look at what occurred.
And they said, well, let's do it together. Or we said, let's do it together. The Bureau says I went down hat in hand. It'd be a cold day in hell. I asked the Bureau for help. Both Jean and Sandy were brutally intellectually honest. I would occasionally bring ideas over to Jean to try to pin down what the source of the losses might have been. Could they have gotten into our station in Moscow? Could they have been reading our traffic? Could they have put in spy dust, which is a forensic tracking chemical, on rubles we used, to pay agents?
Our first task was to identify those people who had access to information about one or more of our lost cases. That list was over 160.
And of those names, how did you assign more importance or less importance to each individual?
We had the 4 members of our task force, as well as 6 others, including 2 from the FBI, list 5 or 6 people who bothered them for whatever reason. They were asked to put these people in rank order. The one who bothered you the most first, second, third, fourth, and fifth.
Where did Aldrich Ames rank on your list?
I had him number 1.
Why?
The change in Rick, the fact that he had so much money. Something was wrong.
Was he aware of your task force?
Oh, yes. We didn't hide from anyone the fact that we were searching for a traitor in CIA.
Later, after the arrest, Early asked Ames what he thought of the task force.
And he said, because I love sitting at my desk, watching Sandy Grimes, watching Jean Bertafay, watching Paul Redmond running around trying to catch this spy, them thinking, oh, there's Rick Ames, he's a nobody, and I was pulling all the strings. And they had no clue, and I loved that.
You're following the money, you're putting all this together, but there was no smoking gun.
Correct.
Until about August of 1992. Something clicked at that point.
At input all of his contacts with Chewbacca, all of his lunch meetings.
Sandy was finally able to compare Ames's bank accounts and his meetings with Chewbacca.
And I couldn't believe what I saw. 17 June, Rick has a lunch with Chewbacca. 18 June, he makes a cash deposit to his checking account. The next meeting is 7 July. The same day, another cash deposit to the checking account. Approximately a week or two later, there was another luncheon with Chewbacca, and that afternoon, another cash deposit. It was, as Gene would always call it, Sandy's epiphany.
You're convinced, you go to Redmond's office, and you say what?
I walk in, slam the door, and I say, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure this out. Rick Ames is a damn Russian spy.
In August of 1992, CIA analyst Sandy Grimes finally identified Aldrich Ames as the traitor inside the CIA.
I walk in, slam the door, and I say, Rick Ames is a damn Russian spy.
My recollection is she sashayed into my office, always extremely well dressed, Talbot's clothes, lots of jewelry, very attractive woman, leaned in the door jamb and said, Redmond, we got the son of a bitch. Redmond
Sort of looked at me like I was nuts. So I went through all the information.
So the Bureau was able to mount a fulfilling investigation of Ames, and the rest is history. I would say, by way of an aside, the Washington field office, who did this under very difficult circumstances, did an exquisite job.
They were afraid he was going to leave the country, so they simply bushwhacked him coming out of his house and arrested him.
Mr. Ames, would you like to make a statement?
On Capitol Hill, the arrest of Ames caused a furor.
The reaction afterwards was explosive. In my view, the Congress behaved in a puerile manner, silly, to the degree that it became almost funny.
War is too important to be left to the generals, and intelligence is too important to be left to the spies.
You had people like Glickman interviewing Ames, and Ames made some negative comments about the CIA and how it did its business, and Glickman comes out and said, well, maybe the guy has something.
The Ames case is perhaps the most graphic and vivid example of the need to make structural changes in the operation of our intelligence community.
Glickman, as I understand it now, has gone to work representing the movie industry, which is more appropriate to his talents because of unreality and glitz.
Ames was directly responsible for the execution of at least 10 of our human assets.
They are the real heroes. It's their story that should be told. They made the ultimate sacrifice.
Ames showed absolutely no remorse for the executions. He showed no remorse for his actions. He justified them. He decided it was all a game.
Ames pleaded guilty and received a life sentence. He's currently serving it in the Allenwood Penitentiary in Pennsylvania.
He said, look, the CIA has called me a Benedict Arnold. They say I'm worse than a Benedict Arnold. The Russians consider me a hero. One country's traitor is another country's hero. It all depends on how you look at it.
His wife, Rosario, received 5 years.
I asked Rosario, I said, when did you find out Rick was a spy? And she demurred and said, well, I never really found it out, which was total nonsense. The FBI has tapes of her talking about, be careful, don't do this wrong. There's a telephone intercept where she's saying, don't blow this, you know how it is.
When she got out of prison, she was stripped of her citizenship and thrown out of the country.
Sandy Grimes and Jean Verdefe really caught this guy.
I have nothing to say to him. It's a waste of my time and my breath.
Case closed.
Case closed. We did our job.
The first Cold War may be over, but the new Cold War may be just beginning. Paul Redmond's developed his own theory.
The law is Redmond's law, and I named it. It's an actuarial certainty. There will be spies in your organization. There will always be spies.